Let me pull up first. So I kind of, where Kayla was beautifully organized. I'm going to be a bit more chaotic, probably in my approach here. I actually kind of wanted to start with just a brief introduction to sort of my relationship to Deej, which I didn't know I had until 2 years ago. So before coming to here, I had not actually been introduced to Deej as a discipline at all prior to this. At my Master's of Fine Arts program, I have one course that was specifically on video games and talking about video games and narrative, which was being taught by a medievalist who writes a lot about video games and medievalism, which is perfect. And I, at the time, was really excited because my entire life I've been obsessed with video games. Ever since I was a kid, it was like always a safe space during difficult times, a safe virtual space. I will even say I've also always had a relationship with video games that is highly emotional. I remember as a kid, I would cry at the orchestral score of Kingdom Hearts because, you know, very deep, clearly. So I didn't know that I had this relationship that's been ongoing for so long until I got here and took Dr. Haven's 5-minute guide course and realized that I'd already started doing this work without realizing it. So I have built and I'm still editing to make more beautiful this website for displaying my portfolio, and there's me, so beautiful. And that initial work, I'm gonna just like slide down here and point out, that initial work at Old Dominion University had us working with tools that actually let a lot of, you know, random normal people make video games, including RenP and Twine. Oh, and there it is again. Check out that beauty, stink bugs. They keep getting in my house. Starting with RenP and Twine, this was kind of like, not exactly my first exposure, but my first exposure in a university setting to using video game making tools. And part of the exciting thing with that is learning that video games can be academic, can be critical subjects. I took some liberties with these and really played around, but even before Twine, I started playing around with the sort of choose your own adventure games in terms of choiceofgames.com. And then Twine, very similarly, is an easily accessible platform, I think, relative to other video game making platforms. So that project really kickstarted what has culminated into my thesis project. But starting there, I kind of just like had to learn the literal mechanics of making a branching story and how to make things connect back to each other too. If you see the shapes that these take, there are these beautiful sort of like almost natural shapes that they form, networking roots. And in the process, realize that narrative form is something that video games really make complicated. And at the same time, they also have to make us feel things, right? To matter. And so starting from there, and let me not put too much. Let me back. Starting from there, I built these projects, started to kind of fall in love with the idea of looking at video games narrative forms. And then when we got here, Josh and I, my partner Josh and I, different Josh, we took Dr. Haven's class together, and so I decided to take that a step further and try to learn something new. Along with all the amazing tools that Dr. Havens was teaching us, I also wanted to learn SketchUp. Part of my impulse was I'm interested in the way that game creators have to actually consider space and narrative as intertwining things, as they also have to have the technical expertise to make these things function in of course, packageable product in a lot of cases. So moving into the SketchUp project, I mostly wanted to think about this as like, okay, let's look at the actual means of production that video games are made with by a lot of, in this case, independent game developers. We use SketchUp and Unity game engine. So with SketchUp, I decided to try and test it, see how it runs. I have these fun little models that I had to figure out how to embed here to actually be able to look. And let me see, make that bigger. So yeah, I went into SketchUp and learned how to build a model using SketchUp's tools, which generally is actually fairly friendly in its free version, though I know architects also often use this software too, so it's kind of interesting to think about the various different disciplines that have to consider space and have to consider virtual space in terms of the space, real space, which we are familiar, of course, in our everyday lives. So yeah, I'm still working through like the so what of all of this, which is kind of like the perpetual problem, I feel like, when you're working with new tools. But I think the so what for me is culminating in the work that I'm doing with these current projects, is that I come to realize I'm interested in space in particular. Interested in space in particular, and talk about this in my thesis project, in which I'm looking at Mist and Paradise Killer. And yes, my primary focus is how those games make us feel. Of course. Oh, no snake bug this time, it's just Joe Biden. Cool. Well, enough said. So the thesis, the main focus is, of course, how these games make us feel and how they do so through both aesthetic and methodological means. But also a big part of that comes down to environmental storytelling. And so there we are with space again, and how space is being used to not only tell stories, but also make us feel things, and also evoke not just fictional space, but real world reference. I begin to kind of like see the connections of all this narratological framework that I've been taught alongside the sort of video game studies that came much later. And within these games, realize that yeah, there are certainly certainly plot lines, but there's also the complicated relationship of physical bodies in this real world and bodies in the games that is different than reading a book. It's I think on the surface you can say potentially less passive than reading a book. There's a sort of active engagement with narrative in a different sort of way that is fundamentally alters how players feel and experience the games that they play. And in researching these, I've been talking about this thesis for a long time, so I've probably become a little fatigued, but a part of doing this is also talking about the actual players and how they feel about the games through their own language. And so part of this project involved collecting a bunch of comments from Reddit and YouTube to try and just parse through what the sort of general emotional responses are based on what people say. And then connect that to the generic concerns of these video games. And a big part of what people respond to is that environmental storytelling, is what I've found so far. Obviously, there's a lot more research to be done, which is going to be super fun. In this case, anyway, I haven't gone through all the GTA Reddits yet, the Grand Theft Autos. That's going to be less fun. But generally speaking, Paradise Killer and Real Mist are games that evoke potentially more positive connections between people, positive in the sense of people are polite to each other, people are kind, generally. Obviously, there are instances where people disagree, as I've come across in research, but those disagreements are less about the games themselves and personal experiences than they are about people reproaching other people for their particular affect in conversation. So generally, findings wise, and this is a huge gloss, so please don't skewer me. But generally, there are more positive interactions around these games than there are around games that are generally more violent in their actions that are available, as well as their visuals. Which is not to say that that old adage of, oh, video games cause violence. Yeah, no, we're not going down that rabbit hole, though we certainly are reading about it. Yeah, so this project was interesting in terms of not just making a video game, but also understanding the sort of audience response to video games and understanding why they matter as cultural objects, essentially. And the last thing that I want to mention, I don't know, like I'm the worst at keeping time, so yeah, cool. Last thing I want to go over, and this is an ongoing project, so I don't want to get into too many details because I might start spiraling into all the research that I'm currently rereading. But I am currently working on an ArcGIS project that was working this morning and has now decided the HTML does not like working. I double checked it right before coming here too. But the project is part of an ongoing work that I'm interested in that this is looking at 2 German novels, and this is actually kind of coming back to what Kayla was talking about at the end of her presentation. Looking at 2 German novels that are about pre-reunification, post-World War II Germany, one from the West perspective and one from the perspective of the GDR. And in those 2 novels, the use of space and geography is evocative of the national identity crisis that Germany experienced at that time, and that is still having ramifications to this modern moment. And in particular, with the rise of ethno-nationalist ideology across the globe. It's interesting to see this because there's also historically, post-reunification, a large resurgence of neo-Nazism in Germany. And part of that, as these novels demonstrate through their use of space, is that the struggle to reassert identity between East and West creates a need for unity, a need for a unified front in order to continue with reconstruction. And people turn to what is already readily available in a lot of cases. So I'm currently working on an ArcGIS project to map the characters' movements in these novels and the evocation of real spaces versus fictional spaces. As we have the fictional spaces propped up against Goethe's grave, for instance. So I don't want to overstep, but that is what I'm currently working on. This is driving me absolutely insane, so I might actually pick Caleb's brain about mapping. But yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble in my chaos. So.